I could be wrong about this, but it's late in the night. I finished up some stuff and now I'm just kind of thinking, let's see, how would I summarize this? A lot of the complexities as to, painting a picture as to how I feel about some of the Iran conflict was somewhat explained in this strange dream that I had. I had a feeling about the dream, and it did stir me, kind of got my attention like some of these strange dreams do. So I kind of talked to myself through it just to kind of unearth like what that feeling was. And so I'm just going to step out and so what I'm not saying is I'm not suggesting I had this dream with full clarity and then it leads me into sharing these words, as though giving weight to or credibility to what I'm saying. I don't know, and I don't know enough about this, and so people will have to consider what I'm saying as me not knowing the details. I'm not going to share the dream, except just that it functioned to, I was already paying attention to things, but, and concerned about negotiations. So it wasn't as much as getting my attention on it, but really stirring me to enter into kind of like a different felt meaning in terms of just my life and other connections and moving past like I guess having too much doubt about it. There's this weird chasm between my participation online and just kind of feeling through the dark, I guess. And so at times it causes me to not always come right out and say certain things or second guess or play down the possible weight of conversation. So I think the dream just kind of stirred me in a different way of just saying, go for it, talk from the heart, see where it goes, and open to negotiation. At least try it. But I don't want people to think that I know more than I'm just attempting to start a conversation. So I'm just starting the idea. I'm just thinking about it. And some of the context is that on the world stage, we see the network of world interaction looming into, people talking about breaking out in these perpetual battles, wars. And when we look at the state of Gaza, we can see the trajectory of the outcomes. And it's devastating to think about, and it causes you to wonder, what were some things people could have tried, like partway through that tragedy, halfway through the tragedy, like what are things that people. So that's what I have in mind is trying to pull back from like the worst that it could end up being in these situations and seeing what's behind the tendency of various ones. It does seem highly likely that they really don't mind if Iran starts to look like Gaza. And so if we're kind of on this side of that tragedy and we're looking at options, that's kind of in the backdrop of my mind. Maybe that's an extreme way of looking at it, but it is in the backdrop of my mind, and it's probably caused other people to also take that approach and think the worst and start compromising and trying to cut other deals. So I get that. So in light of that, I just want to talk through any options, anything that we can think of. I mean, you look through history, there's times where the tides turn on some very basic mechanism. I mean, I recall, times where, like cities were shut down by one little like mechanism that didn't function properly, or tides were turned based on certain forms of communication, or a person with some form of encouragement, ended up standing between, just different occurrences happening. And so you just never really know. So I'm just thinking about all of these things, and it does seem like the world is just worn out, and they're just kind of succumbing to the trajectory of the dominant system and just trying to do best with what they can there, as though they don't know how to turn the tides at all. So anyway, I just kind of wanted to talk about that a little bit. I've been thinking about this connection, if I were honest, because I've been kind of watching things develop somewhat from a distance, or this strange dynamic that's happened online for these last 15 years. And I'm not an expert, say, on Saudi Arabia. I'm not an expert on Iran. But over the years, I've had people share their ideas. I've had them, kind of picking up on the universal aspects of tensions and needs for unraveling these global tensions. And if I were honest, I would say over these years, I've just sensed a certain responsiveness and receptivity to approaching these dilemmas within this cultural context of repairing things on the world stage and addressing the religious dynamics and differences. And so anyway, I guess I don't need to spend too much time trying to at least appeal to some levels of credentials to even talk about this. Basically, from the sense that I've gotten over the years, I do feel like Saudi Arabia has had a willingness to want to negotiate with various groups. I understand there's this tension between, Saudi Arabia and Iran, and historical differences. I tend to think that Saudi Arabia is willing to help and assist, and Iran is resistant to that. And if I were to, I guess, speak into that, I would say, in simple terms, there's been a usefulness in, from what I gather, Saudi Arabia's willingness to compromise and somewhat negotiate with various nations, whether it be the U.S. or some distant portions with Israel and whatnot, and some other types of connections that, maybe possibly from the, if you're looking at it like Sunni Shia divide, it does seem that maybe on the Shia side there's a little bit more of, well, I guess it's not that clean cut. Of course there's different factions, but generally holding to a different type of preservation, a different type, some portions of certain fundamental forms of resistance that need to be fulfilled before making these deals and coming together and joining forces. And I get that, and I actually validate that, so that's what I wanted to talk into. I think that's legitimate. While at the same time, I think there's a usefulness in the Sunni and Shia divide in terms of some portions of, on the world stage, what their stance functions as. Of course, there's a lot of nuances in between the divide and different theological areas to work out. But from what I seem to have gathered over the years, just in terms of the relationship on the world stage, geopolitical strategy, even though they might think like possibly like trying to attempt to work through this, that it might come across as somewhat of a betrayal to negotiate within certain degrees, at least in some network that incorporates ties to Israel. I think what it seems to function as is that you have one side willing to have some level of network with Israel, and then one side that is resistant to Israel. And I think there's a useful transformative approach to that. I mean, it's no mystery or great mystery that there's this tension between Islam and Judaism. And then this also connected tension with Christianity. I think it's come across as this such a continual tension, and let's just be honest, probably horrific covert methods and strategies behind the scenes that probably nobody wants to continue in, and serves to push measures and attempts at negotiation into these like extreme responses, right? And then there's the complexities of the religious negotiations. But just in terms of looking at things on the world stage with, like some connection to negotiations with Israel and this tension with Iran and wanting to continue this resistance toward Israel, I do think there's a useful function there. I'm not saying that I want to revert to this idea that it's either one of those stances that would produce the change needed, because we don't want to just have the world align improperly with Israel, because it's not a transformative approach. But at the same time, you wouldn't have wanted none of the, Islamic nations or represented nations to not have anything to do with that network. It would have just continued to be this I guess slanted power dynamic of sorts. But at the same time, so if the goal really is to have a transformative approach to Israel on the world stage, of which better incorporates Israel, then there needs to, you would imagine there would need to be like that tension of saying there would have to be like a partial yes and a partial no. And then it can't really get to just be like obviously the world, we can't just say like just destroy Israel. And then we can't just say like just adhere to Israel. And so we're kind of in this state where then the question is, how do we go forward with that? Because some groups are just saying, like their response is, we can't keep doing this. It affects the world. And they just want to adhere to this sense of this network with Israel. And I don't know that any of most of the nations, or some of them, aligned in this network don't really see it as a solution. But maybe at some time, because things just seem so impossible, they may see it as like the only option. So then the question is, all right, we're at this gridlock. What is the actual transformative value? And so I do think that Iran has helped raise the radar and had been, pretty consistent that we can't really have like the spiritual transformative value on the world stage in the perpetual trajectory of the state of Israel in connection to the U.S. and then how it generates these divides. It's true that this is situated in how we see the idea of God. And so they have held that stance and that tension of this crossroads between an actual spiritual connotation and how we see God. But of course, Israel would then say, well, the result, though, that we get from you is to just obliterate us. Of course, Israel is going to say that's not the answer. That's not the spiritual answer either. But because of the tensions, that's been the response. Because it's as though there hasn't been any budging on a transformative value among world nations. And so we're stuck in gridlock, and that becomes the response. Israel has also related to Iran as, you are the one in the way of us aligning the world unto us. And so we need to get rid of you. And so, of course, Iran's going to say, well, we need to get rid of you because you're the problem. You're the problem. You're the problem, right? And so neither of these solutions are the transformative value. And it's true that, Iran seems to have had this connection in saying this is similar to the state of the world, and also in other places similar in the US, in how people interpret Christianity as having this similar trajectory over other people groups. And so that's where I resonate with it, is I don't need to entirely get rid of Christianity. I'm not going to attack Christian people because it's ideas. We need to change ideas. And there's been some horrific things done in the name of a variety of religions and whatnot. And, from that type of historical experience, I also just tend to feel or have this experience of wanting something more transformative, believing that there needs to be a different methodology and approach to the idea of God, the force of God being more of a testimony of building relationships and having a spiritual transformative value, and not just these types of nation powers over people. And so that's where I concur. That's where, in my spirit, I feel like I concur with, there is a legitimate blockage that Iran seems to be producing on the world stage to say this trajectory is wrong and not in line with the transformative value of God. That's not to say that in the midst of them getting caught in holding that pressure line between the world, that they haven't done horrific things or got caught in the crossfire and developed, maybe more extreme versions to kind of hold down the fort and hold the tension. I think all world nations have gotten caught up in that, and I think that's a product of hostilities on the world stage. I think, I've seen that in other communities as well, where if you don't recognize the core of the spiritual contribution that other groups have, it gets exacerbated and pressured into the hostile forms of it. And so I guess I don't, what I mean by that too is I get that the world is worn out and tired, and I get that people have been cornered into situations where they don't know what else to do, and so they're just going to opt for the enemy of the enemy is your friend, or these other methods of bringing attack on others, that where the attack just keeps getting provoked all over the place. And I get that people are also looking at options of looking at Gaza and thinking people are just people's lives don't seem to have value in relation to the world powers. And so they don't really care. I'm I'm kind of looking at it and I'm just seeing, like, if it got to the worst of the worst, I know some people will say, well, we died holding to what we believe in. And there are times in history where there's something to that. But I also think the times now are different. Things are on the world stage. After Gaza, the whole world wants a different type of change. They want to shift from this trajectory. There's enough tension in it that it doesn't mean the world is going to nor wants to get rid of Israel, but they do want to transform what Israel means on the world stage. And people are willing to go through the proper negotiations to begin to understand and work through. And to be quite honest, people are actually even really enjoying the tension and the interest in religious dialogue. It's a really interesting conversation. There's a market for it. I think I have great respect for people entering into their ideas, working through it. And I think that's where things are shifting. And so I just want to encourage the different leaders to say, or to validate their position and to say, times are different. You've accomplished what you needed to accomplish. And the psyche of the world is shifting and is changing. And for you to then be able to consider opening up to now forging other types of partnerships, possibly with with other Islamic nations, to begin to see the fruits of that, these historical shifts, because it is different. People are looking at Israel different. Even those from Israel are doing the work to show that they agree to have internal and geopolitical shifting. People want this. We've reached the point of change. And we see the necessity to change and reframe things. And so when I look at it in those conditions, I think, maybe it's an option to think about working with the other Islamic countries that are willing to work with Iran, and maybe even alleviating some of the economic tensions there. I think Saudi Arabia and various ones have proven to want to be a part of these negotiations. And maybe they could even help economically with transitions or alleviating it or negotiating it. But I also think what the young people want is not just, alleviating those things. I also think the world is wanting to negotiate a proper way to relinquish the conflict portions of their religious beliefs. And what I mean by that is, take for instance with like Native people. We're working through wanting to not only just rebuild. Yes, we want to rebuild and we want to be engaged politically. We want to rebuild our communities. And that's kind of a likeness, that you kind of get with Saudi Arabia being willing to work on the world nations to start developing these political nation building approaches and whatnot, and networking economically, which is a part of it, but it's not all of it. The other portion, and I'm not saying it's as black and white as this. There's overlap and there's other portions of involvement, but just in simple measures, just speaking more simply, there is this side where you can sense, it seems like you can sense they have this willingness to want to merge with a certain type of a modern culture with the economy and engage in different relationships with the world nations. And I think that's good. And I think that development has been good. But I was saying, I also agree, though, it's not the whole thing. It doesn't really answer the historical transition of a proper transformation of that historical trajectory of things. And I think that's what I've been kind of recognizing within Iran as I've been following some of the leadership, is that I feel that they have recognized people speaking into that and saying there's also this other portion where the actual change cannot happen, like the actual spiritual transformative change and the healing of the culture and the like de-radicalizing of it needs to happen properly, not from like a top-down pressure of the system or pressure from the world system, but it needs to happen by a transformative approach from the world system to allow groups to have room to heal and all the other relational values and humanizing their stance. And it's through those measures that it becomes de-radicalized. And I think that's also what people, when we're looking at communities that need healing, that's a similar approach that various ones take. When they do tend to seem like they're categorized as, maybe like radicalized, is that they're holding for the need for this proper shift. And they're willing to, a lot of times, die for that. And it's not just like some arrogance of, like refusing to work together, refusing modern innovation, or refusing these other things. It's that there, for a transformative value on the world stage, there needs to be a form of spiritual mutuality where something actually changes in the dynamic. And it's through that we can then also speak to the young people and the older generations to both validate that cultural value, validate the humanity within someone's cultural expression, and then say from there, through their cultural relational validation and universal human rights, where the system is not improperly imposing outward pressures on a group to force them into some kind of compliance, but internal relational validation and mutual building up of groups, is through those portions, change then begins to happen and develop better relational nuance through those measures much better. And so I think that's where I differ with some of these things, these pressures, because from my own experience, I just tend to think that I get that people get worn out and tired because the world puts so much pressure on you, and it puts so much pressure on your leaders, and it pushes our older leaders into, maybe holding strong to things because they know that it had gains haven't been aligned with relational value. And, I think sometimes young people don't know how to, where do they go with that? They try to honor their parents or their older generation, but they also want to be a part of where life is going. And so I think if we can align that better, where we're both connecting to, like it says, turn the hearts of the children to their fathers and the hearts of the fathers to their children. Like you align that generational disconnect, and that has a spiritual value to it because you start to recognize what actual transformative recognition is. And then we can also say, all right, now we're open to other forms of assistance and help in a creative approach on the world stage to start remedying and meeting the needs of people. But after this relational transition takes place. And so that's kind of what I'm thinking about. I don't want to see the worst of the worst thing happen because people maybe don't see that the time has come for them to both be validated in what they've been holding strong to, but also take those steps to start making these deals with those that want to help you, because the shift to then be free from the improper constraints. And, we can even take some of the pressure off of Israel and say Christians can help carry that load, because Christians hold a responsibility to not be putting improper pressure on Israel. They can help alleviate that. And we can start, working on what it means to risk allowing universal human rights to the different nations across the world, formulate creative council groups for representing different cultural nations within different regions, and allowing then those partnerships with these countries that do have some extra funds to start stepping in and then being a part of getting things going and start meeting some needs of people. I think we need to give people time for cultures to give people room for them to work through their own growth of cultural expression, as long as it's not hurting somebody else. Just give people room to work out their humanity and their expression, and just trust that we're not going to stop negotiating for validating people's humanity within these religious discussions, and just trusting that people are going to have those strong conversations, and we can help support each other in that, because these are heavy topics to have. They're difficult to have, but there's a deep interest in it. People are interested in it. Like I said, there's a market for it. There's a usefulness of it. I want to validate the different ones that bring to the table these discussions, because that's where change can happen, where you all are participating in these conversations. And we'll keep doing that. And people, it's useful that they have their strong opinions that they're holding to, because we want to do the work to properly refine the human experience, the human spiritual experience. And we don't want to just minimize it. And so I'm glad that we have some of the tensions of the atheists that really do critique various ones, and that we have the strong opinions of people bringing their religious questions forward. And it's good to have those strong opinions about it as we negotiate, so that we can actually resolve some of it. I believe there's a universal aspect to it. We can resolve it, and we start learning more as we bring our different regional contributions to it. And I think we can do that as we meet some of the very basic needs of populations and nations and whatnot. And, along those lines, we can, try to make sure that we are taking a universal approach to it. Our nation's stable, our nation's protected, our nation's able to negotiate. So anyway, I just kind of wanted to share some of these things. And I don't know, maybe I'm like a eternal annoying optimist, but I just tend to look at it as it's just so devastating to think that we live at a time where the world is in this network, and we have brilliant minds able to, and very passionate, to be able to trade ideas and to try to work through these ideas. And if they were honest, they would probably say they enjoy it. They enjoy the tension of having a good opponent to unearth these ideas that they've lived their lives being very committed to. And there's a market for it. People like to see it. And we're, spiritual questions are universal questions. And I just think that we have what we need to meet the needs, on Earth. We have what we need to start repairing things for nations. There's plenty of people really passionate that they would commit their lives to it. And, maybe we can take some of these trillion-billion-dollar war budgets, and if things are starting to work out, they can really start to be used to help invest in developing nations rather than tearing them down. I just think we have the manpower, we have the resources, and one of the great things that would do well for the whole world's population and nations is if we reduce the war and the conflict, because that's really draining everybody's economies, right? And resources. And anyway, just some things I'm thinking about. So I guess I'll leave it at that. Maybe as I talked through this and kind of open up those mental files, I'll have more to say later on about it. Maybe this is naive for me to talk about, but it is some things that I've been just thinking about. And I mean, I know people are going to have their opinions on not wanting to negotiate with various ones, but I also think times are kind of changing to where now that we're in this at least semi-open source world network with the sharing of ideas, it really is functioning to get people talking in a faster pace to alleviate the, like assumptions between groups and the need for these like covert methods or approaches behind the scenes, and which, some horrific things have happened and been pressured upon a lot of various ones. So I do recognize that that's likely a lot of the story of things that had gone on in the past, a lot of horrific things throughout history. But I do tend to think that things are changing now, and it's kind of shifted the possibilities of interaction, and we may as well attempt to shift into these other forms of approach on the world stage. But yeah, as I was saying, I'll think about it some more and spend some time considering it. A lot of this topic just really situates with my own, like I was saying, like my own personal struggle in trying to unravel history. Because as you follow it through, a lot of the plight of history and lacking more of a transformative approach to healing has to do with these like oppressive forces that just keep being perpetuated. And if there was honesty, it's not as though everybody, how would you say it? I don't know if I want to get into another side discussion here on this topic, as pertaining to the idea of trying to understand the trajectory of the dominant system. It's not as easy as just like isolating it on just blaming certain people groups. Like it really is like a confusing trajectory of collection of people that gets people embroiled in it through the economy and all these other forces. And so at some level, people are both a part of participating in that trajectory because we can't really escape it. And we're also never really able to be validated in our humanity through it, because it's a force that has just collected itself in expansion and unresolved turmoil throughout a lot of history and expanding across the globe. And so I'm just trying to dismantle the idea that it's just like isolated on one people group. It's an energy that's just kind of plundered through all people groups. And, people can just start looking through what their portion of working through their own freedom would be, and withdrawing that from these dominating world powers and starting to work on what it is to develop humanity among different nations and regions and whatnot. But anyway, I'm going to kind of get off my soapbox now and just kind of hold these ideas in my heart and mind and just thinking about it. And just spend some time reflecting on a variety of different options on the world stage and things like that.